Welcome to our lecture series, Global Narratives of Disinformation, Focus on Russia. My name is Sandra Frimmel, and I'm moderating today's session with our guest, Ksenia Poluektova-Krimer. And before I introduce our today's guest properly, I would like to say a few words about the technology and procedures. As this is our last session today throughout the semester, I assume that most of you know how it works, but just in case somebody is here for the first time, I repeat what we always say. So as always, the session will be interpreted into Russian. To hear us in Russian, you need to select the other language channel under the globe sign. And if you have questions or comments, please feel free to ask them anytime and write them in the Q&A section. Just don't be confused. You will not be able to see other people's questions, but we will be able to see them and just read them out aloud. And I would like to say many thanks to our interpreters in advance, who accompanied us throughout the whole lecture series and really did just a fantastic job. Thank you to them very much. И как всегда, сессия будет переведена на русский язык, чтобы услышать нас на русском.
As always, the session will be translated to Russian. To hear us in Russian, you have to choose a different language channel under the globe sign. If you have any questions or comments, please send them to Q&A section. You will not see the questions of other people, but we will see them and we will read them aloud. Thank you very much in advance to our interpreters who accompanied us throughout the whole lecture series and did a fantastic job.
Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ksenia Poluektova-Krimer. Ksenia, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Ksenia Krimer is a Jewish studies and Holocaust historian, and she studied nationalism studies and Jewish studies in the US, in Budapest and Jerusalem, and also, if I got that right, works as a translator. Since summer 2022, she has been conducting research at Leibniz-Zentrum, Zeithistorische Forschung in Potsdam, as visiting fellow in the Department for Communism and Society. A year later, in 23, she was awarded a Sakharov scholarship. It's a year later, but congratulations nevertheless.
Thank you. Thank you.
And in general, she conducts research on the staging of history and the development of historical debates during Perestroika, on historiography in the late Soviet era, and the shaping of post-Soviet historical consciousness. And since the beginning of this year, of 24, she has been doing this in the framework of the ERC project, Perestroika from Below, also in Potsdam. Ksenia, in an interview with you, I read how important it is for you, and here I quote you, that professional historians combat counterfactual false histories and communicate with society at large by offering nuance, complexity, and critical reflection. I found that just highly important and very impressive. And you have also consequently been researching anti-Semitic propaganda in Russia and the Soviet Union for years. For example, in the article Russian Anti-Semitism, long time no see, ? And in several other articles, which have been published, by the way, also in the NZZ and the FAZ. And I would also like to mention your book, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's 200 Years Together and the Russian Jewish Question, an analysis of current trends in anti-Semitism, published in 2008.
Yeah, actually, that's not really a book. That's a tiny monograph, but nevertheless.
Okay, but anyway, very important for the topic of today's lecture. And actually what I wanted to say, the article I just mentioned, so Russian Anti-Semitism, Long Time No See, and your really dedicated research throughout many, many years are the reason why we invited you to our last session of our lecture series. And we have already heard a lot about the narrative of Nazis in Ukraine in some of the previous lectures, which is now also being applied to supporters of Ukraine in Germany and even to Georgian President Salome Zurabishvili. But today we will shift focus to anti-Semitism in Russia. And I am very much looking forward to Ksenia Krimer's lecture entitled Anti-Imperialism and Anti-Semitism from the Cold War and how Russian propaganda fuels it today. So Ksenia, after this introduction, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for this kind introduction and the invitation. It's, of course, thrilling to take part in that exciting seminar. And one of the joys and privileges of being the last one to speak is that I can sort of make some connections between previous papers and some of the topics that were discussed. For example, Elliot Borenstein spoke about Satanism, and I am going to speak about anti-Semitism. And of course, whenever you have anti-Semitism, you do have Satanism. So Satanism, I have it. And of course, Roman Horbik's incredible discussion of the continuities and ruptures in Soviet propagandistic narratives and practices. This is, again, very, very relevant to what I'm trying to do today. I have a lot of ground to cover both chronologically, but also geographically and thematically. And I hope that you bear with me. I also have some веселые картинки for you, some pictures which are really gruesome. So I hope, well, I mean, I hope they make an impression, but honestly, they personally make me sick to my stomach a bit. So bear with me regarding the visuals as well. So without further ado, I'll jump at the obvious, which was the impetus for this paper and for a lot of my research recently. The obvious bit is that Russian propaganda, I think we can all agree, has been spectacularly successful and very cynical in capitalizing on the October the 7th Hamas-led attack on Israel and the concomitant Israel-Hamas war. And capitalizing not only on these two events, but also on the information chaos that these events produced. Some of the key issues that were triggered in this discussion, in the global reaction, anti-Semitism and Israeli practices vis-a-vis Palestinians, but also broadly the Zionist project itself and the legitimacy of the Zionist project, they have been extremely divisive and extremely emotionally charged. And they have been for years, but especially so since the Hamas attack. The Palestinian cause, I think we can also agree with that, is positioned by these discussions and sits at the intersection of two very important agendas today. On the one hand, the so-called Global South solidarity, and on the other hand, post-colonial turn, right? And both of them are exactly the same way, extremely emotionally charged and resonate globally. And this makes it ideal fodder for Russian propagandistic effort, through which it can amplify this chaos and this cacophony and to advance its own goals. So what are the goals that Russian propaganda pursues here? Why does it hijack Israel-Hamas war? It has hands full with other things at the moment. But nevertheless, as I have mentioned and a lot of speakers mentioned before me, I have 4 bullet points here. So the first point is to, chaos for chaos's sake, to create divisions, to drive existing rifts even deeper, so as to destabilize Western democracies, to create chaos and confusion, with the result being that the left accuses the right accuses Muslim communities, fear proliferates. Fear is very good for right-wing populists. Right-wing populists are very good for Russia. Russia loves right-wing populists and this is another line of inquiry, but this is covered by Anton Shekhovtsov's wonderful study, Russia and the Western Far Right. Tangan War that explores that aspect, right? But we're talking about the left more today. So Russia does want to see itself as the leader of the global right wing, right? And it shapes this narrative that look at the West, it's in the grip of decay and it's failing, politicians are failing. While, look at the pogroms in Amsterdam, the logic goes. Look at the demonstrations, look at the campus protests, look at the graffiti in Paris or in Berlin, of which more in a second. Horrible. While Russia, now here's the place to be, right? A wonderful bulwark of stability, normalcy, and calm. So that's the first point. The second bullet point is that whenever you have anti-Semitism, you have conspiratorial thinking. Anti-Semitism is an ideal conspiracy theory. Whatever you put inside reverberates. You can use it and spin it for more conspiracies, for whatever purpose, left, right, and center, right? And a lot has been written, and I have written about that there is a certain ideological vacuum at the core of Putinism, which is filled in by this conspiratorial optics, right? It's the lens through which they look at the world. Also remember that Putin and a lot of his cronies hail from KGB. And by all accounts, Leningrad KGB has been among the most notoriously, viciously anti-Semitic and conspiratorial in the country. Now, that's an achievement, right? I'm not saying here, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that, well, that's because Putin is an anti-Semite. I think this is a very misguided question. It's really besides the point what he believes in or not, whether he has beliefs or not, it's really irrelevant. But rather, it's the optics through which they look at the world, right? So when, for example, last year, pogroms in Makhachkala and other North Caucasian republics break out, he reacts to that in the following way, I quote, "Evil forces operating from abroad are behind that. Western intelligence services, especially the US and its satellites," and one is led to believe which satellites, Ukraine, Israel? How's that logical even? He reframes those pogroms in Makhachkala as the extension of Russia's war against Ukraine and against Washington's global dictatorship, and says that who is the root of all evil here? A spider, a certain spider, right, at the root of all evil. So America and its satellites. And to his domestic audiences, especially those who were born and raised in the USSR, this rhetoric and those images, they immediately bring to mind this, right? Or this. Or this. This is from a movie. Now, the third point has to do with Ukraine. I should have started with that. Of course, Russia is hell-bent on fanning the global discussion of Israel-Hamas war so as to divert attention from its own ongoing military aggression against Ukraine and to relativize it. And for this end, propaganda uses, my favorite bit, the double standards narrative. And I know Sylvia loves it as well, and she has written a very important, comprehensive discussion of that. So this double standard is, of course, the staple of whataboutism. And the idea is to shift attention from Russia to Israel and to claim that the West supposedly holds Russia and Israel to very different standards, and that Israel manages to get away with much worse atrocities than Russia. But the whole point of it is to make this comparison and to put Russia and Israel on the same page. And I would be the last person, I have to make this disclaimer, I would be the last person to be apologetic about Netanyahu's horrible right-wing, religious messianic, extreme nationalist, militant, violent government. But Israel is a democracy. It's a democracy under stress in a horrible situation in the last not only 1 year, but many years with Netanyahu in power. But it's still a democracy with a functioning Supreme Court, with opposition, with media, with civil society. Russia has none of that. Russia is an unrepentant autocracy, not a democracy. It's never been, really. So for Russia, it's a win situation. It's a win when Russia and Israel are put on the same page. And Russia's aggression against Ukraine is also framed as conflict right? You have Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that too is a conflict for them. Now, finally, my final bullet point is the global South bit, right? For Russia, this Middle Eastern crisis is another opportunity to lay claim to the position of the leadership in the global South. So not only do they want to be the leader of the global right wing, but also leadership of the global South. And there is no contradiction here. And they do it by declaring solidarity with the Palestinian cause. Putin did that very early after the Hamas attack. And that gives them a discursive perch from which they can denounce American warmongering, imperialist hegemony, neocolonialism, expose Western hypocrisy, and Western globalist elites. And you recognize all of these very fancy buzzwords. They are very impactful rhetorically today across the world, not only in the West. That's why Russia hijacks and amplifies these discourses and this rhetoric, again, to divert attention from itself as a colonial imperialist entity, aggressive and brutal in its practices and waging a war, right? And many, many other things, not only in Ukraine, right? So what we see here is that Russia is trying to play rather successfully different ideological sides simultaneously, left, right, and center. And it does it because it can, right? It can officially customize all its messages for different audiences, sympathetic with Russian agenda, not sympathetic with Russian agenda. It doesn't really care, as long as it can amplify existing differences and produce more chaos and more discord. Now, I am going to discuss all of this, well, at some length. We don't have a lot of time for that, but that's going to be in the second part of my talk. How Russia deepens those polarizations, where it does it, how it does it, not only in the West, but also increasingly in the global South, most notably Latin America, but also India, Indonesia, and beyond. But before that, I have to make my starting point, which is this. Some of these divisions that it has been exploiting are not new. And Russia is able to exploit them because it has created them earlier, in its earlier incarnation as the Soviet Union. It helped shape them, export them globally decades ago. So we're dealing with the fallout of what they have done throughout the 50s, 60s, and beyond. Right? So in a sense, today's Russian propagandists, they owe it to their forebears from KGB, from propaganda agitation department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, from the Middle East department of the Communist Party, who laid much of groundwork for their current efforts. And I'm talking, of course, about particular Soviet invention known as anti-Zionism, a campaign waged essentially between 1960s to the mid-1980s, more or less, although some earlier signs of its earlier manifestations can be traced back to late Stalinism, most notably 1952 Slansky trial. Mind you, this is anti-Zionism without a hyphen, right? So it's a holistic concept, because unlike any other critique of Zionism, this anti-discourse has little to do with Zionism per se. It's something else, right? Why is it worth talking about today, you may ask, right? I said 1960s. Why it's still relevant? Well, not only because it has informed a lot of today's understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the left. Isabella Tabarovsky writes about that and explores continuities in the rhetoric and images between this anti-Zionist campaign and today's campus protests, for example. This is one of the very good examples. We'll see that in the anti-Zionist campaign a lot, this comparison between Israel and Nazis. But also because this anti-Zionist discourse is relevant for us today, because those demonization narratives or templates, they proved to be so potent and so efficient in that day and age for both domestic and foreign audiences, that a lot of their imagery and themes serve today as templates for demonization of Ukraine by Putin's propaganda. And I'm going to highlight some of these continuities and borrowings for you. So in a nutshell, what did the Soviets create? They succeeded in infusing or contaminating, in this biological term, maybe misguided in my application, but anyhow. So standard Marxist-Leninist discourse, anti-imperialist discourse, with anti-Semitism, and produced an ideology that was sort of scientific, respectable on the outside, but deeply anti-Semitic at the core, and very conspiratorial, of course. And they produced this discourse domestically, exported it globally, gained legitimacy for it at the highest international level. I'm talking, of course, about the 1975 United Nations Zionism is Racism resolution. And they did it at the time when anti-Semitism was actually on the way out in the West. You know, from cultural mainstream, from political mainstream, it was not really appropriate anymore. So they did that. And before moving on to talk about anti-Zionism and its earlier manifestations, I need to clarify one bit for you. I'm not going to go into details, but I said, you know, anti-Zionism in one word and anti-Zionism in two words. Of course, there are different critiques of Zionism advanced from within the Jewish milieu, historically, from outside. And I have put some of the key points for you on the screen. You know, the most obvious critique, of course, is religious. Some religious Jews, not all, believe that this is a secular project, enterprise. It interferes into divine timeline, right? You cannot gather exiles in the land of Israel before Mashiach comes. Mashiach comes, and then you do that. But there are many other, you know, people who advocate Yiddish culture and diaspora identity. They say, well, you know, Zionism claims that living in diaspora is not normal. We love being a German Jew or an American Jew, etc. So you have different critiques of Zionism, anti-Zionisms that are perfectly, you know, understandable discourses, right, from within and from without. The opposition from the left, both the Jewish opposition to Zionism and the Russian Marxists, when now moving to Russia, early 20th century, is very understandable because, of course, Zionism and Marxism were two major emancipatory projects in the early 20th century in Eastern Europe, right? And promised salvation, but through very different strategies. Zionism promised very particularist national salvation, building a political entity in Palestine, right? A Jewish homeland, a Jewish state. Marxists said, no. We envision this kingdom come as this universalist community where there is, you know, to quote the Bible, there is neither Jew nor Greek, right? Ethnicity is abolished. It's not relevant anymore. So there will be no ethnic discrimination. So we offer to achieve this salvation together with all humanity, with the proletariat, right? And of course, they compete for the same demographics in the early 20th century. Young Jewish men and women who are secular, increasingly unhappy because of poverty, persecution, anti-Semitism, and lack of political agency, right? But Marxists and Lenin in particular, in the early 20th century, they were not very much concerned with Zionists. For all the competition and rivalry, that didn't seem to them a successful project, right? It was really struggling. But that changes in the 20s. I'm sorry that I didn't show the Russian slide, but sorry about that. That changes in the 20s because those global revolutions that Bolsheviks hoped to see sweeping across Europe, they didn't materialize. So Lenin suggests, you know, we look at the colonial world. This is where, you know, this global system of imperialism can be maybe not brought down, but at least challenged by revolutions in Africa and Asia. So national liberation movements in these parts of the world, although they are bourgeois in character, bourgeois, we don't like them very much, but they do their job. Right? They could reinforce the cause of the world proletariat. And that is what mattered for them. So contrary to popular belief that the Soviets allied with the Arabs after the founding of the Israeli state in 1948 or after the Six-Day War in 1967, they do ally with the form allegiance with the Arabs and commit to their cause in the 20s. Most famously, Bolsheviks reject the Balfour Declaration of 1917. That's the British public commitment to the eventual establishment of the Jewish national homeland in Palestine. And on the same grounds, Jews are a minority there in Palestine. They come from Europe. Our sympathy should be with the Arab workers, who this minority and the colonial Brits are exploiting. So Zionism, according to Leninist doctrine of this, well, I would say nascent third worldism, is an instrument of imperialism against the movements of national liberation, and also in a larger scheme of things, an obstacle to the worldwide advance of communism. So there you have it. Very early on, we have this framing. And as for the actual Zionists who remained in the USSR, somehow took time to make Aliyah to Palestine, of course, their fate is very tragic. Most of the time, they are purged, exiled, deported, destroyed individually and as a political force. By the 30s, it was all over for them. So this was the early Soviet attitude to Zionism, to Zionist enterprise in Palestine. What about anti-Semitism? Now, until the Second World War, Bolsheviks spent a lot of energy actually denouncing and combating anti-Semitism, both vulgar anti-Semitism and, well, whatever expressions of political public anti-Semitism. Lenin viewed it, of course, as a reactionary force that drives a wedge in the proletariat unity, calls it a scapegoat that diverts attention from the real exploiters, from real agents of exploitation. But also pragmatically, the Bolsheviks remember very well how anti-Semitism was weaponized against them during the Civil War by the whites and also by the Poles during the Soviet-Polish War of 1919 and 1921. So you have this, notorious Żyda Komuna narrative, right, which portrayed the Bolsheviks regime as the Jewish regime. So you have this Trotsky as this devilish figure. It's funny when I was not funny actually, but funny. When I was looking for that image, I somehow remembered that he looks like a devil, right? Again, Satanism, that he has hooves and horns and tails. He has none of that, but he looks like he's a devil, right? Drenched in blood, controlling the Kremlin, right? And you have skulls here under the bridge, on the Kremlin bridge, and victims of Bolshevik terror, right? Unleashed by the Jews, according to this propaganda. And so they were the Bolsheviks, very much aware that this is a very powerful weapon and wanted to destroy all possible connections between their regime and this kind of allegation that this is a Jewish regime. Also, again, very pragmatically, they welcomed very much aid coming from American Jewish organizations in the early 20th century, right? When Soviet Union combated hunger on massive scale and humanitarian catastrophes. And they wanted to make sure that their record was sparkling clean in this department. Now, I am sorry. So it all changes in the 40s, even before the end of the war, really. You have this shift of paradigm that takes place and moves the regime from this proclaimed, declared internationalism to Great Russian chauvinism. You might remember this notorious Stalin's toast at the victory banquet, etc., for the Great Russian nation, the older brother. And in foreign policy, Stalin promotes this doctrine of two camps, which means no alliances with non-communists, no alliances with non-aligned countries. And this is a watershed moment in our story because you have the start of the Cold War, 1946, 1947. You have the creation of Israel, 1948, and you have Stalin-Tito split, 1948 as well. And these are important considerations that frame some of the deadliest campaigns of the 5 final years of Stalin's reign. And I'm talking, of course, about the explicitly anti-Semitic anti-cosmopolitanism campaign, that sort of targeted Western influences, and in the process unmasked Jewish intellectuals and culture makers that hid under Slavic-sounding names. And of course, the notorious doctors' plot against doctors' killers, doctors' saboteurs, and the destruction of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, the murder of Mihoels, that's 1948, 1952. In this discussion, I want to always make those connections to today's Russian propaganda or today's Russian anti-Semitism, domestic and exported, I'm sorry. And these discourses, of course, continue to reverberate. They're very powerful. Stalin, in the 40s, late 40s, coins this word for the Jews, code word, rootless cosmopolitan, the targets of his cosmopolitanism campaign, anti-cosmopolitanism campaign. In Russia today, you have ethnic liberal. And you also have unmasking, increasingly so after the start of the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, unmasking of Jewish patronymics, supposedly hidden, of those celebrities who oppose the war and who oppose the regime. So everything old is new again, as we say. Now, after Stalin's death in 1953, anti-Semitic campaigns are discontinued, and the Soviets go back to ritualistically denouncing anti-Semitism from time to time, but not very often, because actually the problem is supposed to be solved, isn't it? Pravda stated in 1967, there has never been, and there is no anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. But then it drops the subject altogether, because in the late 60s, you have anti-Zionism. In one word, right? You don't need to use the word Jew anymore. You have the code word Zionist that replaces rootless cosmopolitan or killer doctor, right? Needless to say, and that's a very important point here, that the Soviets were very well aware of the divisive potential of anti-Semitism and how it can be weaponized, and they experienced it themselves in all those posters that you see. So they weaponized it to destabilize Western societies in so-called active measures, активные мероприятия, campaigns that they waged during the Cold War. And of course, I draw your attention to this wonderful, very relevant book that talks a lot, extensively about these. And I would mention two such operations, again, for the sake of highlighting continuities, because they remind us of some psyop operations that Kremlin conducts today in the West. The first one is Operation Zarathustra. Thomas Reed discusses it in his book. So what happens? 1959, there is this KGB orchestrated campaign. Swastikas and anti-Semitic slogans appear on synagogues, first in Cologne on the eve of Christmas Eve 1959. And then basically all over Western Germany, right? Juden raus and all the other things that I don't want to pronounce here. A total of 833 anti-Semitic incidents involving some 321 perpetrators. And by January 1960, it just explodes globally. It's all over the place. Hate crimes, graffitis, pamphlets, anti-Semitic attacks, various places, literally across the world, from London to Berlin, including East Berlin, Venice, Oslo, Cape Town, Montreal, Rhodesia, Hong Kong, Tel Aviv, and other Israeli cities, Mexico City, Sydney, right? In the United States, you have students and faculty members of the University of Maryland who one day come to the parking lot to find their cars, 200 cars, pinned with pamphlets that read, Jews are through by 72, right? So at the time, it was widely assumed that it was, basically too much attention and too much media coverage to the initial incidents in Cologne that inspired those copycats, right? But of course, Germany finds itself under a lot of pressure internationally. There are mass rallies in London in front of the German embassy. There are boycotts of German goods. There are even some German expatriates who are sacked from their jobs. So you have this, I don't have this, I'm sorry. There is I'll have to explain. There is a famous caricature with Germany as a patient with the swastikas on the face. And then you have Konrad Adenauer and other European leaders, and Ben-Gurion, General de Gaulle, the British Prime Minister, Dwight Eisenhower, leaning above him, and he's in bed, Germany's in bed, and Konrad Adenauer says, well, he has measles again, right? So Germany as a patient is sick with measles, right? So it eventually transpired that it was this global KGB active measure carried out with the help of Romanians and Stasi, Romanian Securitate and Stasi, both lending their helping hands. And Thomas Reed, the author of this book that I cannot recommend enough, talked many years later with some of the KGB officers who were implicated in this campaign, including Oleg Kalugin, among other people. And they all admitted that they translated into German hate letters and mailed them to German Jewish families. They vandalized cemeteries or had somebody do that for them. The idea was to maintain anti-Semitism, so as to discredit and weaken West Germany by portraying it as this, impotent, unrepentant society still riddled with neo-Nazis. And in order to alienate the British, the French, the Americans, the Allies, the occupying authorities, delayed or prevent German rearmament, paralyze the political debate, and drive a wedge into NATO. All very familiar goals and objectives, of course. No, it is very destructive, but what else does it achieve socially? And besides this obvious political damage, it also damages the societies affected. And here's how. Before running this global operation, the KGB do a test run. Intelligence officers they wanted to gauge the reaction of the communities. How do the locals react to that? So intelligence officers travel to some little village in the vicinity of Moscow and do the same, daub swastikas on tombstones, topple Jewish tombstones, desecrate the cemetery. And they report back to the center that, the majority of villagers were, of course, appalled at this vandalism, but there was a very important minority that felt emboldened. So their sort of latent, dormant, passive prejudice was triggered and converted by this external stimuli, anti-Semitic stimuli, into active belief that the person can act upon. So they became what Reed calls anti-Jewish activists as a result. Another example of many of such operations meant to maintain anti-Semitism in the West and to radicalize some portions of Western societies, intimidate other communities, is discussed by another wonderful book by Christopher Andrew. He wrote it on the basis of Vasily Mitrokhin's papers. Now, Vasily Mitrokhin was an archivist for the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Service, defected to the UK in 1992, and documented some of those active measures. And so he described how the KGB staged provocations in order to stir up animosity between Black and Jewish communities in New York in 1970. So what they did, they planted delayed action explosive device in one of the Black neighborhoods, and then staged calls from two African-American organizations claiming responsibility on behalf of Rabbi Meir Kahana's notorious far-right religious Jewish Defense League. I mean, they were horrible enough, but they didn't do it. They also distributed fake GDL leaflets containing racial slurs against African Americans. Horrible things. I don't want to repeat and quote them here. They wrote fake letters, pamphlets, either way, to both the Jews and the Blacks, etc. So we see a lot of continuity here with today's Russian psyops. The red swastika, of course, immediately brings to mind the more recent Paris graffiti incident that happened last year in late October, weeks after Hamas attack, and a week after Stars of David, hand-painted Stars of David appeared in Berlin on houses that had Jewish residents. In Paris, they were randomly drawn on the walls, and it was really not quite clear what it was. And this was deliberately ambivalent, right? It was not explicitly anti-Semitic, but given the context, it was very emotionally charged and created a lot of confusion. So probably you've heard about this story. Libération reached out to the guy behind it. So there were 4 Moldovan nationals who made those stencils. And there was a photographer who documented everything and leaked it, uploaded the images on Doppelganger, that notorious disinformation, misinformation, fake sites, Russian campaign. So Libération contacted the Moldovan businessman, also the guy who ran MMM Ponzi scheme in Moldova at some point, did time in prison for financial fraud. So, I mean, a delightful human being. And asked him, what did you do? Why did you do that? And he said, well, I wanted to express my support for the Jews of Europe. And, you know, it's your stupid French politicians who misunderstood me and misinterpreted my true intention. How dare you not understand that this is an act of solidarity? And then, of course, and he urges also Jews in Europe to put on Magen David, put it on their cars and doors and all of that. Well, very, very good suggestion, you know, in October 2023, given the background. So I did a lot of digging on him and his social media. He runs them in Russian, and there is absolutely no connection to Jewishness or Israel. A lot of pro-Russian content in Russian, military songs and all the usual. But also in 2014, he posts explicitly anti-Semitic, propaganda articles, reposts anti-Semitic content. So again, you see this polarization, blaming the authorities, and this deliberate ambivalence. But back to the USSR of the 40s. So in 1948, of course, USSR and Ukraine, it had a separate vote for the in support of the UN partition plan, and in 1947 and in 1948 for the establishment of Israeli state, for reasons that do not need to concern us here. And again, if I want to make a link to today's propaganda discourses, a very common element of the anti-Ukrainian discourse is that, well, Ukraine is a fiction, not a real state, right? Lenin invented you. You owe us your existence, right? You're fake, you're a proxy of America. The same logic, the same rhetoric is applied to Georgia, for example. Medvedev famously, notoriously said, you didn't exist before you joined, also a good word, the Russian Empire in 1801. So it's a classic imperialist logic, right? We give you your identity, right? You start to exist when we notice you and annex you. Right? But it's also used against Israel. There is a very common anti-Semitic line. Stalin created you. You owe us, and you have to be grateful. You owe us your existence. You are a fiction of the state. You're a non-entity, right? And we see that a lot in Prilepin's notorious letter to Comrade Stalin, 2012, and many other discourses. Now, by the fall of 1948, you have hostile references to Israel and Zionism in the Soviet press, trying to make it an unattractive option for the Soviet Jews to immigrate. Ilya Ehrenburg says, well, what are you thinking? It's a capitalist society. Who would want to move there in their right mind? It's a horrible place, right? But the first rehearsal of this anti-Zionist campaign that will be waged from the mid-60s is outsourced to Czechoslovakia. And I mean, of course, the show trial of Rudolf Slansky, the general secretary of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, who is charged with basically Zionist conspiracy, right? There are 13 other members of the party, high-ranking communists, 11 of them have Jewish origins. The irony, of course, is that they're Marxists. They oppose Zionism and Israel, but they are charged with, this is a classical conspiracy. Supposedly there was an Zionist imperialist summit in Washington in 1947 with President Harry Truman in attendance and some prominent Jewish figures from the American establishment. And they conspired. Why? What for? To commit espionage and sabotage against Czechoslovakia for the US in exchange for American support for Israel. So you have it, this international conspiracy, espionage, Israel in cahoots with the US, all major talking points, all major tropes. So we see these ideas already in the early 50s, but there is no political expediency just yet to weaponize them. But they're already there. The political expediency comes after the Six-Day War of 1967. at the same time, you see that Israel, of course, is drifting towards Western capitalist democracies and the US as its major ally. And the Soviets solidify their union and allegiance with the Arab states and support the Ba'ath coup in Syria, etc., etc., etc. So sign up to some of the pro-Palestinian rhetoric coming from these societies as well, from these nations. Now, in 1958, the second salvo of this anti-Zionist campaign, the first was Slansky trial. The second thing is Trofim Kichko's book. Yeah, this is one of the posters, right? Israel and Arab countries here. Trofim Kichko's book, Judaism Without Embellishment, is published in 1963 as part of Khrushchev's anti-religious campaign, right? So far, so good. He's a member of Ukrainian Academy of Science, publishes that in Ukrainian, and I have to make a very important disclaimer by virtue of me coming from Russia. There is a lot of historians who claim that the Soviets weaponized and exploited anti-Semitism and defended in Ukraine, given Ukraine's history of Nazi occupation, in order to drive a wedge between Ukrainians and Jews and destabilize Ukrainian society, to undermine it from within. I think this is it's a powerful argument and it should be explored. I hope it will be, but I am in no position morally, ethically to talk about that. Just, make this mental note. Now, so the Kichko book. So publishes in the Ukrainian, but immediately translates that into Russian and also into English and French, I think. And well, I've downloaded that and I have some pictures from there. So buckle your seatbelts. The pictures are worth of Der Stürmer. They're pretty horrid, right? Basically, it's a anti-religious campaign. So he says, well, Judaism is the worst religion, the most reactionary, exploits women, exploits the poor, because there's always this class bit. Many outrageous claims. He also misquotes, and this is important, he misquotes Jewish religious texts, Tanakh and Talmud, to claim that these texts sanction the Jews to rob and manipulate non-Jews. And he also misconstrues the idea of chosenness. Jews as a chosen nation. They are chosen for a special service, for a special relationship with God, to serve them, according to Jewish tradition. He interprets that this chosenness means you think that you're better than us, right? And of course, this if you think that you're better, you can never join this proletarian solidarity, this community. You will always be apart. And then, of course, there is this essentializing rant about Jews striving for world domination, conspiracy of Jewish bankers. They are in cahoots with American imperialists, the Rockefellers, who have been eyeing oil deposits in the Negev. Rockefellers are not Jewish, but that doesn't really, matter for him. He's a bit carried away. But this crowning achievement, which connects him to this anti-Zionist campaign, very obviously, is the claim that Zionists collaborated with the Nazis during the war to achieve the state, right? There is, of course, they translated it, so there is an international scandal immediately, outcry coming from the Western communist parties in Canada, America, Italy, all over the place. Khrushchev nearly cannot continue his Scandinavian tour because people come to protest against this racist book, but also the mistreatment of Soviet Jews that it reveals, right? And the Soviets kind of pull back a bit, and they publish a year later in Pravda, 1964, kind of this very careful admission, yeah, that's probably a bit too much. It could have hurt somebody's feelings, God forbid, really. But all this reaction is completely uncalled for. And then another anonymous piece appears, which actually structures and sets the tone for a Soviet typical reaction to those kind of Western criticism and Western reactions. That there is, all this criticism is pathetic tricks of our enemies. There's this enemy seeking to discredit us, plotting to tarnish our reputation, pulling the strings in Western media. What is the fuss about? What really happened? They ask. For Kichko, this scandal didn't hurt his career at all. He continues to be promoted in this Znania, Knowledge, Information Education Society, gives public lectures, continues to publish in the same vein. Although they pull the book from the stores, they say, but they really don't. And also in 1967, he publishes Zionism as the Weapon of Imperialism. And then later on, before a new rendition of this Judaism Without Embellishment, he calls it Judaism and Zionism, well, just to be sure what the new agenda is. And it's used during the anti-Zionist campaign, anti-Semitic campaign in Poland. So it's translated into Polish. So he's really ahead of his time, this guy. So those two tentative salvos of the anti-Zionist campaign, the Slansky trial and Kichko. The campaign, the anti-Zionist campaign, really is launched after the humiliating Soviet defeat. Yeah, that's also his book. In 1967, the Six-Day War. So Arab allies of the Soviet Union, lose the war, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, then United Arab Republic. And for the Soviets, it's a slap in the face. How come, the explanatory machine has to go into full gear? This is a tiny state. How could it possibly, win that war and also triple its size? And, there must be some powerful, omnipresent, perfidious global force at play, lurking behind the curtains, and somehow linked to Israel and the United States, its ally. And which force is that? World Zionism. So it's a classical conspiracy from the get-go. And in the words of William Corey, who wrote a book about anti-Zionist campaign, but also later trajectories of its practitioners and Panitz and other anti-Semitic groups, the Soviet anti-Zionist campaign equated Zionism with every conceivable evil on earth. Racism, imperialism, capitalist exploitation, colonialism, militarism, crime, murder, espionage, terrorism, prostitution, even Hitlerism. And this last bit is, of course, crucial for demonization, right? The worst evil so far has been Nazism. Let's equate it with Zionism to give potency to this discourse. How do they do that? The same way that Kichko did. They misinterpret this religious concept of chosenness and spin it to mean, well, you think you're better, you're a superior race, you're cunning, you want to exploit other people. And from this comes the claim that Zionism is racist also, right? It insists on its own on Jewish superiority and difference, right? And the Soviets managed to pull it through the United Nations in 1975. And, this gives additional legitimacy to their propaganda because the United Nations agreed with that. So if it's racism, it's ideologically identical to Nazism. And that appears early on. Well, this is Zionism is racism. It appears early on in a lot of their books that, for example, this notorious book, Fascism Under the Blue Star, claims that Nazis were in cahoots with Zionists, and Zionists wanted to, allow them to kill and help them to kill as many poor Jews. Of course, there is this class bit, in order to claim the state, to legitimize their claims for the state, right? And I have to make this brief, have to jump in here and say something that I haven't mentioned. Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the leader of Palestinian Authority, defended his PhD in Moscow in 1982. And the dissertation was dedicated to exactly that, connections between Zionists and Nazis throughout the war. He defended it. The Soviets classified it. Now it's declassified. So it's a fascinating read, of course. And fascinating illustration of how potent those ideas are. Some of those anti-Zionists, they claim also that Hitler borrowed ideas from Theodor Herzl, etc., etc., etc. But the interesting thing, they wouldn't be themselves if they didn't plagiarize also from the sources that they condemned. For example, you have a documentary film. Yeah, well, this is Zionism and Nazism. You have a documentary film, Secret and Explicit, The Aims and Acts of Zionists, Тайные деяния сионистов, тайные явные, цели деяния сионистов. And they recycle the footage from the Eternal Jew, a Nazi 1940 film, and used Nazi newsreels to pass them off as footage of of Israeli brutality. I'm sorry. Another very prolific anti-Zionist author, Vadim Begun, repeatedly plagiarized Mein Kampf. Just substituted the word Jew for Zionist. It was easy, right? And no wonder that refusenik and educator Ruth Okunev, she analyzed those Zionist discourses. She made 3 columns. Black Hundreds rhetoric, that's an extreme nationalist, anti-Semitic, chauvinist, anti-Semitic organization from Tsarist Russia, Nazi, anti-Jewish propaganda, and anti-Zionist propaganda. And she found a lot of similarities. And she sent a letter to Brezhnev titled A Few Pages of Analogy. Well, 87 pages of analogy. He never replied, but those connections were obvious. And sure enough, all of these central tenets of this ideology, they are, well, this is the film for you, this against Spider. This is basically a structural continuity from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a notorious Tsarist forgery from 1903. The existence of international cabal that aspires for world domination, that uses manipulation, plotting, controls the banking system, controls the media, has infiltrated Masonic lodges, etc. I will skip the part about who these anti-Zionists were and about this anti-Zionist kruzhok. We can discuss that in questions. I don't have much time for that. So you have another prolific author. His book was one of the first ones to be published, 800,000 copies in Soviet Union alone, translated into tons of languages, importantly also Arabic. And some of these Arabists, because they were journalists, people with Komsomol connections, people in publishing houses, writers, authors, all sorts of people, amateur historians. But the Arabists, people who were Soviet scholars in Arabic studies, they also knew what the Arab anti-Zionist discourses were. And some of them were very vicious, also inflected with Nazi propaganda, because Mein Kampf is translated into Arabic in the mid-30s, serialized in Iraqi newspapers. And then you also have this important figure, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, who is basically a Nazi propagandist during the war. He broadcasts in Arabic and basically spreads all those anti-Jewish talking points. Calls for the final solution, calls to limit Jewish immigration to Palestine, participates in the formation of Bosnian SS battalions who fought against partisans, Albanian SS battalions, who fought against partisans in Bosnia. So a delightful personality, right? And he inflects Arab anti-Zionism, which had a lot of also religious elements and also this reaction to Israeli policies with those vicious Nazi tropes. So those Soviet Arabists, they know that, they translate that back into Soviet Russia, they bring it back, repackage it as anti-Zionism, and then export back. And so that you have this echo chamber, this circulation of this vicious propaganda. Now, Baruch Hazan published a fascinating study of this Soviet propaganda that explores the infrastructure behind this campaign. So how they did it, what kind of channels they used, etc. So to export those anti-Zionist narratives. And you have that in front of you. Some of them are used even today. Friendship societies, cultural agreements, embassies. You have also reports and correspondence of a Soviet ambassador in New York, in America, in the Soviet embassy, who also can correspond with his superiors in KGB, and reports on how you can drive the wedge and how you can, put some groups of Jewish public figures against others on the question of Israel and Palestine. So they have a lot of channels that I will just leave here for you. Of course, solidarity demonstrations, but also importantly, the use of Jews as witnesses to Israeli atrocities. So you have to have a Jew as a witness. That's a fascinating thing. They still do it today in Russia. public Jewish figures who are supposed to testify to the existence of anti-Semitism in Ukraine. Some of them hail from Ukraine, so they tell about their childhood memories from the Soviet period. Russians also made a horrid movie. I mean, it flopped in the box office, called Свидетель, the Witness, which is stylized like Adrian Brody in The Pianist, a Jewish cello player kidnapped by Ukrainian separatists, who is forced to witness all the atrocities which actually we know Russia committed, Bucha, Mariupol, maternity ward, but he is the witness to the truthfulness of that narrative. And that's very much like a Christian dogma of the Jew, who has to witness, right? Because they suffer, they are dispersed, they are the testimony to the truthfulness of Christian narrative. But we don't need to go into this complexity now. And they use Muslims, of course, with the same, also as spokespeople for their cause. And also Soviet Anti-Zionist Committee of Soviet Jewish Intelligentsia is created as an official body, extremely vicious and extremely productive in the materials they produce. Now, I am trying to wrap it up already. Now, what are the means and techniques of this Soviet propaganda, anti-Zionist propaganda? Deception, guilt by association, repetition, deliberate misuse of sentiment. And I have some examples here. For example, they would broadcast the story of a Soviet Jew who wants to return to the USSR. Why? Because Israel doesn't have enough kindergartens. Now, everybody who knows anything about Israel knows that what Israel has plenty of is kindergartens. And the argument went, instead of kindergartens, they have synagogues and gambling houses. Now, gambling houses are banned in Israel. You can't have them, but that didn't stop them. Well, this is a funny bit, just to get the ball rolling, but some of the bits are really not funny, because they also accuse Israelis of sterilizing Arab women. And this is a clear inspiration behind the Israelis harvest organs from Palestinians. That's you hear that on American campuses from professors in American universities today. In October 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, the Soviets say that Israel recycles its own footage from 1967, which was triumphant, heroic, and very successful, to fake, military successes. Well, this is completely unsubstantiated. There was no evidence found, no Western reporting of that. That never happened. The Soviets, remember, do it a lot. They recycle Nazi reels and pretend that these are Israeli atrocities. They also claim that Israeli right-wing circles and the elite circles were behind and engineered 1972 Munich massacre. So it had nothing to do with Arabs, they say. There is a lot of focus consistently on the murder of Palestinian children, which they call cold-blooded, deliberate, etc., and also refer to Anne Frank. It's funny because the Soviets really are not willing to talk about the Holocaust a lot publicly and to acknowledge its reality. But here they use it, and they say those in Israel who are responsible for the policy of reprisal against Arabs are insulting the memory of the victims of terror. And Anne Frank warned such atrocities should not be repeated, they say. They also frame, and that's also another important bit for today, they frame Israeli treatment of the Palestinians as genocide. 1/4 of all references to genocide throughout the period between 1948 and 1988, 40 years, in Pravda, central newspaper, especially in the wake of Israeli invasion of Lebanon, have to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it is framed as Israelis carrying out genocide of Palestinians. And by framing Palestinians victims of genocide, of course, Israelis and Jews cannot be victims of genocide, of the Nazi genocide, which the Soviets denied happened, right? They talk about the genocide of the Soviet people in general, and still it's a very important propaganda trope today. So how's that disseminated today? That's my final, I hope to be very brief for that. How's that disseminated today? So Emanuela Tulengi, who studies Latin America, talks about media synergy today between Russia, Iran, and Venezuela's Maduro regime, and also China, which saturates this media space with conspiracy fantasies, anti-Semitism, whataboutism, fake news, moral relativism through 3 major outlets: Actualidad, Russia Today, Russia Today in Espanol. Iran's Hispan TV, which spreads horrid narratives like Zionists are behind COVID or too many Jews in Hollywood, etc. And Venezuela Telesur. So they don't need really to, Russia doesn't need to spread the most vicious narratives, but it gives space to Iran and to Venezuela because they share studios, they share cameramen, they share operators, and they also highlight each other, amplify each other. So Russian embassies in Latin America repost and share all of these other outlets. So you have this massive campaign where they have where they help each other and work in synergy. Now, my final bit: what are the key narratives that come out of this cacophony, which is very well engineered and orchestrated? Well, of course, the first bit, we've talked about that, double standards. Israel is held to different standard than Russia. The second bit, Russia is an important geopolitical player in the region and wants peace, and the West wants escalation. And here you have this conspiracy fake bit that Zelensky sold weapons to Hamas that Hamas used against Israeli civilians, because of course Zelensky is a Jew and Jews are after money always. Then you have, I'm sorry, I have a typo here, gray zone, but maybe that does it right. So you have this gray zone. That's the thing. This is a vicious thing run by Max Blumenthal, who has proven to have connections to Russia because he traveled to some Russia Today event to Moscow on several occasions. He's also receiving money and funding from Iran. There have been leaks about that. He's a staunch denialist of Hamas attack against Israelis on October the 7th. He says it never happened, and the Israelis shot their own people. So you can take a look at those, headlines. They're quite outrageous. October 7 testimonies reveal Israeli military shelling Israeli citizens with tanks and missiles. Israeli army gassed my son like Auschwitz, mother of slain Israeli soldier says. Or Israeli propaganda behind Hamas mass rape narrative exposes grifter and fraud. So they also deny the reality of rapes and claim that Israeli soldiers raped and abused Palestinian women. So you have this inversion of blame, right? Well, these are headlines for you. You have this inversion of blame. We didn't do it. They did it to themselves. And this is, of course, similar to classic Russian propaganda line accusing Ukraine committing all the atrocities that Russia has, in fact, committed, from Mariupol to Bucha and beyond. Okay, so to conclude, you have these deeply entrenched demonization patterns developed by Soviet Zionologists that equate Zionists with Nazism and racism, and they are remarkably similar to how Russian propaganda portrays Ukraine, also a state run by Nazis. Both Ukraine and Israel are described as anomalies, unauthentic, artificially created. Ukraine owes its existence to Lenin, and Russia, Israel owes its existence to Stalin, but also, Western powers. Both are seen as not independent, proxies or puppets of Western countries, especially the United States. There is a very important streak of anti-Americanism in all of that. Both are accused of committing historical genocides, Nakba and Gaza, but also the massacre of Poles in Volhynia and the genocides, what they call the genocide of Russian speakers in Donbass. And the fact of genocide is supposed to delegitimize their claims for a national statehood, right? Both are portrayed as essentially exclusionist, racist, homogenous communities, regardless of the fact, very white, by the way, regardless of the fact that Israel is not white, and there is a lot of multiculturalism and ethnic heterogeneity in both Israel and Ukraine. The same pattern of inversion, you did it to yourself. That didn't happen to you. You did it to yourself. We didn't do it to you. And in both cases, of course, the objects of such propaganda are framed as ontologically different, satanic, inherently deceitful, manipulative, capable of every moral depravity. In short, the Nazis. Thank you.
Ksenia, that was an amazing historical overview. That was such a rich and insightful and enlightening lecture that I I find it really hard to ask questions because there is so much to digest.
Yeah.
Maybe I start with an atrocious inversion you were referring to. You talked about the film Svidetil, so The Witness, and how in this film the Russians equal themselves to Jews by making themselves kind of a witness. And you also mentioned Anne Frank, and I think to be honest, I don't know whether you said this today or whether you wrote this in an article, but either you said or wrote that Russians label themselves as the new Jews. That would be in the Svidetil, The Witness, and that Russophobia actually is referred to as the 21st century anti-Semitism. I even don't know how to comment on this. But when you mentioned Anne Frank, the German incident came to my mind. You probably heard about this, that during the coronavirus pandemic and the Querdenker demonstrations, a young girl of, I don't know, 11 years old on stage said she feels like Anne Frank because she had to celebrate her birthday just hidden and not in plain sight, in secret, because somebody could tell the neighbors. And I find these similarities, especially when we think about the Operation Zarathustra, quite striking. And I would like to ask you, how strong do you think are the similarities or connections here today?
Well, I mean, I think there is no doubt that Russia is vying also for the position of the main victim in all of that. And the sad part is that it happens on all sides. It's not only the Putinist majority or Putinist propaganda that would love to portray Russians as the new Jews. We have this outrageous video and song by a pro-Kremlin singer Schnur. There is a song which is titled "Русский в Европе новый жид." Входа нет or something. I don't know. I use that for this article that you're referring to in FAZ, where they have those Russian shirts and so on Jewish stars. And the rhetoric goes, well, there is this genocide again in Europe against Russians. We're canceled everywhere with the new Jews. So, but it also resonates on the on the anti-war, anti-Putin side of liberals who always see themselves as victims of injustice and canceling or whatever. So this discourse is very, very powerful. And there is very little immunity to recognize that, well, what kind of language are you using? You cannot make an equivalence between anti-Semitism, which is a historical reality and a lived reality for the Jews, and Russophobia, which is an ideological construct, right? But we see that, I think, I mean, there is a big conversation that needs to happen when we talk about this cultural shift in Western societies that is not very tolerant to the idea that, well, Jews are still holding on to that victimhood. The logic goes that, you know, you've used it up, this symbolic potential. There are new groups of victims that can identify with this and can claim it for themselves. And we saw that during COVID with this appropriation of yellow stars. It's also, I mean, the use of Anne Frank, I find it very problematic because it's a very specific book which is read and adopted for the stage in specific ways that celebrates optimism. It brackets what happens to the Frank family. You know, she dies in a camp, you know, months, weeks before the liberation by the British. They die horrible deaths. Only Otto Frank survived and also edited that diary, leaving out certain pieces. It's also a testimony of an assimilated Western Jew. So, I mean, it's problematic as a reference point on many grounds. It's very easy to identify with her. She's been such a cultural icon. But what we see here, if we have this broader conversation, is the idea that we want to be the victim, right? We want it for ourselves. We want to phrase ourselves. This is the source of legitimacy, this victimhood. Give it to us.
Yeah, there is a lot of absurdity in this discussion about claiming victimhood for yourself. I have another question which is not related to this, but there is a question from the audience which is a little more related to what you just talked about, Nico Ensler, and he asks, how did these anti-Zionist propaganda uses change from Khrushchev to Brezhnev to Gorbachev to Yeltsin? Was there a break in the narrative during Glasnost, for example?
No, of course there is. During Glasnost, this is discontinued. By 1986, this really loses steam. There are other concerns, although there is an interesting episode when Sakharov returns from his exile in Gorky, and Sakharov was married to Elena Bonner, who was Jewish. There was some, I don't want to mislead our viewers, there was some discussion of where they want to sell, what they want to do, I don't remember. And Bonner had a different opinion from Sakharov and from Gorbachev. And Gorbachev says, oh, well, you know, she's a Zionist. That's what you do when you succumb to Zionists. So that's part of your language. I'm sure he, you know, was very sympathetic to Bonner. This was spoken out loud. So this was deeply ingrained in the minds and in the speech. Now there is a change coming from Khrushchev to Brezhnev and from Brezhnev to you know, early 80s. Khrushchev's major focus is anti-religious campaign. He uses that, you know, to channel some some anti-Semitic energies. But basically the peaks of the anti-Zionist campaigns are 1971, 1974, and basically 1982, 83, with the creation of the this anti-Zionist committee, which consisted of Soviet Jews. Now, there is, of course, reaction to what's happening in the Middle East, reaction to Israeli invasion of Lebanon. There are sort of tides and ebbs in this campaign. But we also, and this is a topic that I haven't explored, we also have to be aware of what they borrow, what they import from the Arab world, and how Zionism is shaped as this term of violent political abuse by that time for different purposes, but also against America in the Cold War dynamics. I know I haven't answered this question fully, but that's, you know, that's a topic for a paper to describe those nuances. There are changes, of course, and there are fluctuations. Another important point I think needs to be made that some of the people in this Kruzhok anti-Sionistov, anti-Zionist circle, they continue to have careers in pyramids. William Corey writes about that in his book. Some of them actually inspire this very specific brand of Russian science fiction. You know, there is this fascination with Strugatsky. They are the cultural heroes of intelligentsia. But there is another brand of that in the 70s and 80s, personified by a certain guy by the name of Yefremov. Yefremov or Yefimov, I'm afraid to be misspeaking here. I have to check that. Anyhow, but he uses some of those themes, and his utopias are not set on different planets. They don't travel into space. But there are those battles between Atlantes and Etruscas. And the Etruscas are Russians, and those Atlantes are Jews. And he has very clear, he and also people who write in the same vein, he has very clear anti-Semitic innuendos, how he describes those. You know, these are alien, materialistic, conniving, arrogant creatures, and the Etruscans are true, naive, spiritual. So you have this conceptualizing of Russian nationalism in very conservative terms, which is happening through these people and through various cultural channels. Right? So this energy of anti-Zionism then percolates into other cultural pursuits. That's also, I think, important to say.
Yes, it actually is. And I really do hope that you will write that paper, which would be the prolonged answer to that question.
Yeah.
So we have another question by Anonymous in German, who is asking, what do you think? Do Western politicians understand how serious such narratives are, and how do they react to that? Because has got the feeling that they underestimate this and don't take it serious enough.
Well, it would be very preposterous on my part to advise anything to Western or German politicians. I've been living in Berlin for less than 3 years. I do feel that, yeah, this is underestimated. And historically, Russia has been misinterpreted. And the danger, the viciousness coming from that political culture is underestimated. I think we all, as academics, as people who publish and do research, it's also our duty to inform and to dispel some of the mythologies and sentimental idealizations. But there is also part of the answer is that your response also has to be measured. Thomas Reid has a very interesting podcast about that Stars of David stencils in Paris and doppelganger. Not the stencils, but the doppelganger and how doppelganger hijacks this anti-Semitism bit as well. And he wonders there, how shall we react? Because the reaction to doppelganger was really very vocal. But that gave the Russians an opportunity, people behind this campaign, all those, guys in those IE industry, tech industry, all those designers and people who basically pitched the idea of this campaign to Kirilenko, it allowed them to claim, look, they're writing about us, we are successful, give us more money. So reaction strengthens them. It makes them stronger. But not reacting or not reacting sufficiently is also dangerous because they continue unrecognized. And people continue to click websites that are not legitimate Guardian or FAZ or, Bild or anything else, right? So you also have to be smart and measured in not being this, not screaming wolf, but be very clear that there is a vicious force that we are dealing with. Vicious. They're not only after money that the narrative was. They are about sowing this cynicism. The truth is unknowable. There is no way to know the truth. Everybody lies. Everybody is corrupt. I think this is against Western liberal values. They are trying to confuse us about our values. They're trying to send the message that this is nonsense. You can never know the truth. We have to resist it. I mean, it sounds maybe very lofty, but I feel it, that there should be a lot of effort geared into that.
I completely agree with you. And there is a question by Marina Achimovskaya, which is closely related to this. Thank you very much for the 14th lectures, for researching such a difficult topic as disinformation, for the historic parallels and connection to modernity, such a hot topic today as anti-imperialism and anti-Semitism. Now comes the question. And how to counter disinformation and propaganda, how to treat not the symptoms, for example, by labeling the level of credibility of information in social networks, but the disease itself. And is this possible, or are such ideas and practices capable of disappearing only with their carriers? How applicable is Germany's experience for Russia? That's many questions in one.
Many questions rolled into one, yeah.
Yeah, but I'm sure you will answer them.
I'm not quite sure. I think that Germany, in my experience, and I've been very grateful for being able to move here and to live here, but I see a lot of naivete, unfortunately, and a lot of sentimentalization of Russia, as I've said before. How you can counteract that? Well, by, again, publishing research and drawing attention to the language and the visuals used. It's even on the level of posters, right? It's the way those things are framed. We have to have complicated conversations, not conversations that are reduced to sound bites and buzzwords and hashtags. Because hashtags, of course, are emotionally very charged and mobilizing, but they are primitive and they sort of, I think, cloud our vision of what's happening. So educational efforts, I see most of the difficulty actually lying with academia and with arts in Germany. I think these are two domains that haven't been very sober about the forces that they endorse. Let's put it this way, right? They haven't been. I don't think they are very cognizant of the complexity of this. And it's very easy to demonize and dislike Netanyahu. Who doesn't dislike Netanyahu, right? But when you start talking about delegitimization of Israel, or anti-Israeli politics, what does that mean, right? I mean, we don't have that with any other culture. We don't have this with Russia. We don't have it with China, with Iran, you know, countries that commit horrible atrocities. This is not to relativize, but just watch your language. This anti-Israeli critique. You know, we know that anti-Americanism is a bad thing, but we are somehow blind and deaf to the usage of this language. Criticize policies. But, you know, the talk of Israel not having the right to exist, I think is very problematic. And we hear that a lot, unfortunately, in academia and especially in contemporary art world. This use of hashtags uncritically. I haven't been able to answer any of your questions. I'm sorry.
No, I think you are actually, and you're just prolonging the discussion, and that is wonderful because you mentioned posters, by the way, and you were showing a lot of caricatures and material from satire throughout the 20th century, and you showed that satire about Jews, anti-Zionism was highly important in Soviet times, as caricature was an overall important tool. So when you laugh, you don't feel fear, you feel superior. That's quite an important moment here. And it also sticks to your mind. And I was wondering, so caricatures are not as important as they were, but there are other forms.
Yeah.
Maybe one could call memes the contemporary caricatures. What about their meaning in this discourse today? Are they still? It's just because you use so much visual material. I'm wondering whether it still is of significant importance, or whether it just stays in the past because our usage of media is different.
No, those caricatures, I don't think that they are. Well, they continue to circulate. I occasionally see not those Soviet ones, but new versions of them, both in Russia and also in those campus protests, for example. I think the new medium for that is TikTok and Instagram and all those new social platforms that generate sound bites and very also simple, consumable images very quickly, and they go viral very quickly. So this is the new platform that, you know, I'm not a boomer, but I'm older than a typical user of TikTok. So we don't have access to that experientially, unfortunately, and we should, I think, for our research. I think this is where a lot of this conversation is shaped. I was at a TikTok conference last year in Berlin, dedicated to the sort of commemoration of Holocaust in TikTok. And I was like, what is this? You know, why is that even serious? Why? I wasn't aware, and that's my bad. But there is a lot of Holocaust denial happening on TikTok. And you need to respond to that within the same medium, with the same weapon. Now, there was also a film that I didn't show you. I showed you this spider web that they made in 1973, Тайные явные цели деяния сионистов. It's horrible. I mean, I watched it. Russia, actually, it's funny, they banned it in 2021, but then somebody re-uploaded it on YouTube and inserted comments with today's anti-Semitic rant. And it's very difficult to watch. I mean, it's just really, they recycle Nazi reels and all the accusation in the book is there. So by banning it, Russians made it attractive. So it's back into circulation in certain circles, maybe not very widely, but nevertheless.
So actually we learned that the old material used is still in a way circulating. It is 7:45. I don't have any more questions in the chat. Is there anything you would like to add? Is there
There's always something to add, but I think I've spoken too long and too much, and I'd leave.
It was amazing. It's just
your wonderful guests to sort of process some of it. I understand that it's a lot, and that is really not that nuanced as it should be. I originally had, of course, a much longer text, but at least sort of I wanted to frame this for you to look at the origins of some of today's most charged discourses and talking points. So I think my job here is done today, but it can be continued, of course, on the different media.
Yeah. So I just would like to thank you once more, because we could really go on with our discussion much longer, but yeah, unfortunately, our lecture series today and also the whole series has come to an end. Ksenia, it has been a pleasure having you here. No matter that the topic is none of pleasure, but the more insightful it is, and we really shall keep aware of these atrocious inversions which are constantly happening. And I would also like to thank our listeners and say that in case you missed a lecture or two and would like to listen to a lecture again, you can do so on our YouTube channel or also on the site of on the website of the Department for Slavic Studies. There are links too. And meanwhile, the team of our lecture series, and I would like to mention them all again at the end. So Sylvia Sasse, Muriel Fischer, Irina Herasimovic, Nanina Graf, and myself are working on an anthology based on the lectures. And I think this would be an appropriate place to continue the discussion we started today with the Ksenia-Krimer's lecture. Yeah, and for now, it sounds a little strange after that topic, but I wish you all a happy Christmas holidays. We really, it's a difficult thing to say, but nevertheless, Ksenia, thank you so much.
Ruin Christmas for people again. That's what we do.
Yeah, and thank you all for being here.
And the translators. I know I spoke very fast. Thank you so very much. I know it's a very tough job. Thank you.
Yes, they did. Thank you all, and goodbye for the night.